Hi everyone, welcome to Clutch Entertainment today. And today I got John Paul with me. He's a seminarian at Kenrick Lennon Seminary. He's theology too, and it's his sixth year, right?
That is correct.
Yeah, so we're going to have him today on the show, and we're going to be talking about how to approach politics as a Christian.
Yeah.
Or as like even a layperson in general. So there's a lot of different approaches we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about a faith approach. We're going to talk about a philosophical approach, and we're also going to talk about like an approach to like modern society. And then we'll have a few questions at the end for John Paul or JP.
Either one.
So, all right, so let's get right into it. So we're going to start off with an approach with faith. So first of all, we'll talk about some of like the biblical ideas. So what do you want to go into with like the New Testament or Old Testament? Which one do you want to go into
Yeah,
first?
so if we just want to jump in right into the biblical foundations, I think it's important to recognize the culture that the Old Testament happened in. I think sometimes we read it, there's a fancy word for this, anachronistically, I believe, where you read the present time into the old time, and you don't respect it for what it is. So here's an example. In the early parts of the Old Testament, government did not work at all what we're used to, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You belonged more to a people than a land, but your people had the land, right? Stuff like that. The most important thing to pull from it is that God and politics was the same thing. Religion and politics were not separate distinctions. They were one and the same. The ancient people saw themselves as very dependent on the gods, and so you had to keep your society ordered to that. And a lot of times this resulted in, like the local king being worshipped as a god or God's representative.
That makes perfect sense. Mm-hmm. I mean, having like that figure, kind of like how like priests are in the Catholic Church,
Yeah, right. And we'll kind of progress further because obviously it'd be very odd if a priest were elected president of the United
yeah,
States.
Exactly.
That I would find that very strange.
Well, that would be in today's society. We'll get into that too.
We'll get into that later. But I wanted to kind of zero in first off with the Old Testament, how some of this stuff came about. So the first obviously God's people, the Israelites, were called out of Egypt, out of slavery, and God promised them a land. He promised Abraham multitude of descendants, and so these people have wandered in the desert, and they end up in the Holy Land. These people do not have the same theology that we have now in the modern day church. We have a lot of developed theology, and they did not.
Right.
So, for example, a lot of Old Testament figures were polytheist. Abraham probably thought that some of the other gods were real at times, and certainly a lot of the other Israelites. He certainly thought Yahweh was real, but Yahweh was slowly leading him to show, listen, there's only one of me, but it took a while. Mm-hmm. For example,
got your notes there, right?
I've got my notes here. I wanted to point off first to Samuel. When God led his people out, he didn't appoint anybody to lead them right away. He had his prophet Moses, and Moses led the people, and then Joshua led the people into the promised land. After that, there was the time of the judges, and judges were basically heroes. They would rise when Israel's enemies would be fighting against them. And like Samson fighting against Philistines, Gideon fighting against the Midianites, I think, and so on with many others, actually. There's a whole slew of them. But in the first book of Samuel, we read here that the people begin to grumble. Chapter 8. I was thinking it's at the very beginning of Samuel. It's not till chapter 8. Israel asks for a king. Now, Samuel tries to say, no, this isn't good, he's very displeased with it. And it's very odd, because he doesn't immediately say why. But here's the thing. In the ancient world, a king was somebody that would rule over you, and you thought of him as something divine. Implicitly, God was the king of them. But the people were becoming hesitant because they were this very fractured group of people.
They need a representative.
They needed a representative. And so now there's this tension. These people want a leader, but God is their king.
They want that physical thing.
Yeah, and that makes sense because they don't see that. You got to remember, these people don't see themselves as spreading the good news of Jesus Christ to every creature under the heavens. They see themselves as a people united by blood and covenant with God to the land. They didn't really care much about saying, oh, Yahweh is the right God, let's go evangelize, let's go send out missionaries, and they didn't stand with the Torah, out in the middle of Egypt and Alexandria and or Ramesses and be like, Yahweh, is the true God. All these other gods are false. So what you're seeing is now this development in Israel where they have a king, and the king's goal mission is to uphold the law. So you have Saul is the first king of Israel. God eventually relents and lets Saul become their king. But Saul does not, he ends up trying to manipulate the Lord. He does not follow the way of the Lord, and so it doesn't end well for him.
Right.
But then you get David. And David is described as having a heart after the Lord. In fact, interesting enough, David commits many sins throughout his time.
Right. Mm-hmm. Nobody's perfect.
There's one sin that he does not commit.
Is that the one with God, worshiping God and all the mind hearts? Okay, the commandment, right?
Absolutely. His heart was for the Lord. Mm-hmm. And you see this all throughout the Old Testament is what makes a good king? One whose heart is after the Lord's own heart. And many of the kings don't do that. Many of them build temples to Baal and do horrible things. And then you get some kings that do some, they tear those things down and then their sons rebuild them.
Right.
But then something very, very devastating happened to them. I don't think we as Christians can fully comprehend how devastating this event was. The Babylonian exile. Are you?
I've heard a little bit about it.
Yeah, so basically, you have the Israelites. Well, you have God's people, and they basically get invaded by the Babylonians, and they crush the kingdom. The people are taken away from the land, and they lose their king. And so people now have this problem because God made a promise to King David that his throne would never fall. And remember, these Jews are struggling because God gave them this king, he gave them this land, and he is stronger than these other gods. And yet the Babylonians destroy the temple so they can't do sacrifices. Imagine if you just couldn't go to confession.
That would be terrible.
They lose their king. So no one to protect you. It seems like God's promise failed, and you lost your land. So, you have to move to this faraway land. There's this new language, there's this deep suffering that happens. Much of the Bible is actually written about this time of the exile. You get books like Lamentations.
Yeah, I've read some of that.
Yeah. There's one happy verse in there, and the rest of it's just.
Well, lament means to grieve.
Yeah. You get all that, and it's basically people struggling with this. We were faithful to God, but we're living in a foreign land with this foreign king who's worshiping other gods. How do we do that? And then a miracle happens. The King Cyrus of Persia sends them back to their land. It's kind of mysterious what happened there. He just seems to yeah, guys, go back to your land. And by the way, here's some supplies to rebuild your temple. But there was one condition. They were to remain a vassal state. So they did not get the kingdom restored. So this is where you begin to see a lot of the biblical literature shift again into the Messiah. This is where they start hoping for Messiah because they think we're an oppressed people because we are a people meant to be free for the Lord, and we're not.
And that's where it goes into the New Testament.
This is where we're going to get into the New Testament because if you remember, there was a tension. The people wanted a king, but God was their king. So how does God fix that? He becomes man as a son of David and takes the throne. Now, obviously, this should be a big scandal to us because we are claiming that Jesus is this new Davidic king. He's going to restore Israel. He's going to rebuild the temple's rebuilt. But, he's going to kick out the Romans. And, so the apostles are thinking about this all through the Gospels. They think Jesus is going to become a ruler. But there's a very interesting verse. Let's see. I'm going to try to find it. Yes. So Jesus feeds 5,000 people. So this is, in the Gospel of John, chapter 6, verse 1 through 15. I'm not going to read all of it. But we know the story. Bunch of hungry people. There's 5,000 people. They're very, very hungry. And Jesus takes 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. And he uses that to feed the whole people. Now, imagine if you were in a crowd of people, and this is ancient times, there's no Walmart, there's no Deerbergs, no grocery
CVS.
stores, none of that. You're just in a field and you're hoping that your crops don't fail because that's your only source of food. And this man takes 5 loaves and 2 fish and makes enough food to feed everyone. So much so that there's some left over. Well, here's how it ends up. The people saw the sign which he had done, and they said, "This is indeed the prophet who has come into the world." Perceiving that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the hills by himself.
Yeah, because he was making sure that they weren't taking him as a king, like a physical king.
Right.
More of a divine king.
Right. Everyone's thinking, oh, he's going to be a physical king, but something's becoming obvious. Jesus is indeed king, but not of this world. And we get that later, of course, when he's before Pilate, my kingdom's not of this world, and also in the Gospel of John, very rich, very, very rich gospel. What does that mean for Christians? Firstly, when we say Jesus is our king, we mean it as a king of grace. He's the king who reunites us with God, which is something much more fundamental than whoever the earthly king is at the moment.
Right.
And actually, what you see here from this point on in the New Testament, not a lot of attention's given to earthly rulers.
That is true.
Because the Christian stops thinking about the problems of this world and begins to think about the next. So the first principle I want to hold I want to think about as Christians is to remember who we belong to first. We belong to Jesus, and Jesus is not of this world. He did not raise up an army, and he told his apostles who raised swords against he told them to put their swords away.
Yeah.
He's doing the complete opposite. He's not a revolutionary. Who gets released instead of him? A revolutionary.
Exactly.
So Jesus is taking this earthly idea of politics and just flipping it on its head. Because might be help to kind of switch gears here, because I'm actually assuming a lot when I'm speaking about like the gospel. I'm starting to speak the gospel, but I haven't given the context of what that's being spoken into. So it might be helpful to kind of go into the philosophical underpinnings.
So we're going to talk about the philosophical approach now.
Yeah. So
he's going to go into Aristotle's and was it
right.
Machiavelli?
So Machiavelli.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So let's just for a moment just put Jesus to the side. Don't actually like in your life do that, but just follow me as I make this thought experiment. Jesus hasn't come, let's just say, and we just see the world as it is, and we're just living in the world. Well, we've got a lot of problems that we got to face. You know, we've got we got to get food, we got to survive, but we also want to develop a society in which we can thrive, right? Humans build these societies, and
economical.
And it's very interesting. Aristotle kind of notes that there's this difference, like when it's your family, like when you're dealing with your family, there's a natural bond there that doesn't need laws and regulations. Like, I don't think anyone's family sits down and writes a constitution.
No.
And then everybody like sign on. It's like, all right, if you're a citizen of this family, you have to pay 10% of your income, and we'll build you nice. It's no. Politics comes to play when it comes to two humans who are not family members entering into
some kind of bond or friendship, or acquaintanceship, or something like that.
I think friendship is actually a very good word. Like Aristotle would say that everybody in your city, and he called it the city. He had this understanding of a city-state, but in your society,
or called allies or whatever.
Yeah, your culture. That there is something that brings you all together, and you pursue it as the common good. So in the Old Testament, the common good would have been the law. It would have been Yahweh, worshiping Yahweh. Yeah. That's what brought everyone together. How did you know you were a good Jew? You followed the law. How do you know you're a good king? You upheld the law. And this would be true with all the different city-states of the ancient world. Like, it depended on who your God was. That was the common good, was worship of your God. Now, by the time of Aristotle, obviously those are the Greek gods. But Aristotle would also say that, you know, there's a lot of particulars in certain cultures that need to be discerned. So we know that different cultures have different ways of expressing things and different things they emphasize, right? Like some cultures put a lot more emphasis on the arts. Others put more in technological advancement. Some in human relationships. Some cultures are much better at fostering human relationship than others. And it's very good in those societies that they really play that up. What Aristotle would basically say, you can't just draw boundary lines and assume that will like make people be friends.
That makes sense.
Yeah. So we'll get into later how that looks in modern society, because it's actually something very much changes in the modern era. But yeah, Aristotle had this sense that what brought a community together was to have some common good that everyone was pursuing together. Think about like when you go to the gym and everyone's there to work out and they're supporting each other to work out.
They're there to improve themselves.
Right.
Yeah.
The common good you could say of that is to work out. And in that society, friendship is built. Obviously, it's better that people at the gym should help encourage one another and not shame one another.
Bond.
Yeah. It's not a competition.
Right.
And that's actually a very important thing to remember, that in a country, in a state, the common good is not foster competition. Ideally, it fosters friendship. And friendship is we're pursuing the same thing together, and it's not like, oh, if I acquire this, then you won't get it. You know, it's not like there's a trophy at the end of a racetrack.
Or using someone as a means to an end.
Right.
You know.
Right. So that's how Aristotle approached it. And then you mentioned Machiavelli. So Machiavelli wrote a work called The Prince. And it was basically how to rule. How, as a ruler, do you keep power? Which is interesting because Machiavelli doesn't start with what's good for the people. He's starting with what keeps the ruler in power.
That's a little backwards.
I think so, but it's what he did. And so he basically said a ruler can be feared or he can be loved. And if he has to choose one or the other, it's better to be feared than loved, which is very interesting. He basically would think that, like, as a ruler, if you want to stay in power and you got to keep people from overthrowing you, you have to use force. And
Well, fear causes hesitation. So I think that's
Right.
the big thing. Whereas love is more of like, oh, he just cares about me, so I don't have to worry about anything.
right, that's the way he's thinking. And I think there's something true in that, because as Christians, obviously, we hold to the fallen nature of humanity. This would actually be good to make 3 distinguishments of among approaches. Whenever you approach politics, you must ask, what is your idea of human nature? This is very key. So,
Or like morality in general.
morality also is based on what the human is.
Okay.
Yeah, you don't say, all right, what's our moral statement? It's what is the human person?
Right.
And there's 3 approaches to that. You've got, one of them is humans are basically good, and we just need to figure out the right system, and we'll get going, and we'll create the perfect society, right? Like everyone desire, like I think most people don't wake up trying to kill each other. I think most people just want to live and let live. So there's something attractive to that. A third view is that humans are intrinsically evil would be the wrong category, but it's, as a Christian, we would call it evil. But we'll just say animal instincts. So I'm just in my heart of hearts, I'm just looking out for myself. I just feel my own hunger. I feel my own thirst. I only seek to satisfy those, and I'll help my neighbor to the point that it's advantageous to me.
Well, our whole goal is like in our brains is to survive. you
Right.
know?
And
that's
yes.
that's basically what you're going into is
Yes.
we think of ourselves and we have to think, oh, I gotta survive. I gotta protect myself from this tornado or protect myself from
Right.
this war or whatever. Like I
Right.
gotta go hide. Like
Right.
that's our basically animalistic instinct, like
Right.
you're saying.
Right. Oh, absolutely. And there's something true about that. So we see this tension. There's part of us that's good, and then part of us that's actually selfish, but that's still good in some way. It's good that when I feel hunger, I try to feed myself.
It's not to where you get it to an extreme. That's what it is. It's the balancing
Yes,
act.
and Aristotle would say that virtue lies in the middle. But then there's a third position of human nature, and it's what I like to call the nuanced Christian approach. It's the middle of the two.
Right.
It's basically humans, this would be the Christian perspective, humans are made to be good, but we're wounded, we're broken in some way. There's some part of us that is the that causes evil in the world.
Our imperfection.
Our imperfection, our sinfulness. I mean, it's us who start wars.
Right. So how would we approach the modern society?
So, first things as Christians I'd like to say is we are not trying to build a political utopia. This has been a kind of a theme that's been coming up in Catholic culture, and I think it's important to repeat again. We're not here to create the political utopia because...
I think it's good for anybody, though, in general, not just Catholics.
Yeah, but see, the Catholics, we have a framework in which we understand this because we basically would say the primary problem of the world is human sin.
True.
And the only way that's going to ultimately get fixed is if God saves us. And God's told us how he will save us. And it won't be taking away the suffering of this world.
Right.
It's in Christ. Christ who allowed himself to get beaten and killed. Not a very good way to, most political figures didn't rise to power by being killed.
And martyred, yeah.
And martyred.
Yeah.
I would like to, with that in mind, I'd like to read from this passage. So this is 1 Peter. To give you a context, the Christians are a minority in the Roman Empire, and Peter is writing possibly from Rome. You can look up scripture scholars debating where he wrote it. But it's written during the Roman Empire. Christians are a minority. And this isn't the time when Christians are necessarily getting killed. They're not. It's not quite the open persecution that we get just a couple of years later when Nero breaks out. But they're not friendly. No one's looking to the Roman Empire as friends for the Christians. But here's what Peter wrote, our first pope. Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor in Rome, as supreme, or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to praise those who do right. For it is God's will that they, by doing right, you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish men. Live as free men, yet without using your freedom as a pretext for evil, but live as servants of God. Honor all men, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the emperor. I think this is very key for Christians as we approach the modern world.
It's kind of like what Jesus said, give to Caesar what is Caesar.
Yeah,
what God, what is the God.
Right. No, I'm glad you brought that up, because actually the New Testament, a couple times in the Gospels, and I think that St. Paul or somebody mentions it later, they pay their taxes.
Right.
Peter's like, hey, Jesus, do we have to pay taxes? And Jesus is like, well, it doesn't actually really matter. Pay your taxes and live for me. Now, obviously, it's good to be active in your government and to make sure, there are unjust taxes. There are unjust governments. But as Christians, we don't look at injustice and say, violent, revolt against
Rebellion,
this.
yeah.
No, we recognize that ultimately God will be the one to raise us up in the end. We don't need to, again, I could keep going into nuance after nuance. There is a place for self-defense, but we're not called to create wars based on our own feelings of injustice against us. We're called to forgive and to love even those, if a president who's not, the most Catholic or Christian guy or woman who's, maybe doesn't make the best decisions, pray for them.
Don't hate
honor
them.
them. Right. Yeah. Honor them. Don't curse them. Sometimes you see people from both sides say, curse out the president they don't like. Let's pray for them. You can disagree. And I disagree with a lot of people on a lot of things.
Same thing.
But you don't need to, you don't need to let your anger rule you. Because we have Christ.
Right. So I think that's the main message of,
Yes.
having politics as a Christian.
Yes.
Yep. We want to be able to, use God, as our leader more so than
the
people.
Right.
And
God does allow certain people to be in charge, even those who don't follow his will. I mean, I don't follow his will perfectly, and he lets me be in seminary.
Right.
So we can even have a respect for those whom we very much disagree with. So.
Gotcha. So I got a couple questions for him, John Paul. So one question I have is what resources can we use if you want to see something online about this?
Yeah, I mean, we were talking about this earlier, but
you were saying a book, right?
Right. So I think some good books just to help the Christian imagination. The first one would be From Christendom to Apostolic Age, an understanding of the state that the Catholic Church finds itself in, because it's very different from the Middle Ages. Mm-hmm. The second one would be The Religion of the Day, because there's a lot of squabbles sometimes in the Catholic community of we need to get a Catholic into office and they need to just enact a bunch of Catholic laws. That's not the way Christians have worked in the past, and that's not the way, that'd be great. I would love to just see, a bunch of very just laws passed. But we are called to something deeper. I could go into a million more verses. So read the whole Bible, read the whole catechism too.
But those two books are
those two books would help. They would help you orient to understand the Christian imagination and the Christian worldview.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Gotcha. How can we promote a message to our neighbor with politics in like a cordial way?
Sure. Well, first off, don't yell at them.
Respect their beliefs too. You think?
Yeah, I'd say respect the person. I know you're saying respect their beliefs. I think it's better to say respect the person and understand.
Yeah,
the
I don't mean like just be
yeah,
like,
yeah. But to understand that, really try to also understand your opponent's position well. A famous theologian with us Catholics is Thomas Aquinas, and he was famous for arguing for his opponent's position better than his opponent could.
That's crazy.
So do that.
Right. See how they view it.
Right. And
see their
understand, because
perspective.
there's some truth that they're holding to, and you want to affirm that.
And then my last question is, what was your inspiration for, getting into like this approach to politics
Sure.
and why? Like, was there a specific person or?
So, Jesus Christ, Pope John Paul II.
Is that who you're named after?
Absolutely.
Nice.
Talk about, or as I should call him, John Paul the Great. I'm trying to get that going.
Right.
John Paul faced Nazi Germany and communism.
And he survived an assassination too.
And he survived two, actually.
Was it two?
There were two
Okay.
attempts on his life.
That's crazy.
One of them was actually by a deranged priest, unfortunately.
Oh, no.
Yeah, I thought he was holding the third secret of Fatima. But the other one seemed to have links to the communist Russia.
Oh, okay.
But JP2 did not rile up the people with armed resistance. In fact, Poland peacefully became free, which is remarkable. It's such a marvel of history, the way that he handled that. And then he himself, living under Nazi Germany and communist Russia, he lived out his priesthood very well. He worried, his first and foremost was loving Christ and suffering for Christ. And the power of that surrender freed millions of people. So he's the first one, of course. And then secondly would be my professor, Father Paul Hamilton. He taught me political philosophy.
Oh, okay.
And
So
I hope if he ever watches this that he likes it.
I'm sure he will.
There's so much more that you could cover though.
I'm
Because
sure.
we didn't even mention things like natural law. There's a million more Bible verses. Spiritual warfare. How does spiritual warfare play into this? How did the politics change from the Middle Ages to the modern age?
I'm sure there's a lot more.
There is. But here's the message as a Christian. Love Christ, love your brethren, fear God, honor the emperor,
There you go.
whoever he may be.
That's a good message. So thank you for watching Clutch Entertainment today, and thank you for being on the show today, John
Thanks for
Paul.
having me.
Appreciate your insight, and if you have any other questions in the comments below, you can just leave them, and you can answer some. And if you want to give me links to those books too, I can post in the description too.
Yeah.
But thank you much for watching Clutch Entertainment, and have a great day. All right.